Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Science of the Times. And Syma, this week we're going to be talking to a behavioral ecologist, so someone who spent her life studying animals and why they behave like they are, and is now kind of getting into animal brains.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating because she's actually studied a very wide range of animals, right?
From pigeons through to fish, through to chimpanzees that we'll talk about today. No, I mean, it's really broad, and she's particularly interested, in what we'll talk to her about is about tool use in animals.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess as humans, we might arrogantly think we're the only ones who can do this, and sort of use and manipulate tools. But it turns out we're certainly not the only ones.
No, I know so chimpanzees, use rocks and sticks and whatever for doing all sorts of things. Some birds like crows use tools. Even there's some evidence of insects using tools. So it's kind of, it's really interesting behaviors. It's not super common, but it happens, across. I think even some fish have been seen using tools.
Oh,
I mean,
really?
they're not like going down to B&Q and getting an electric drill or anything. I mean, it's like just using a stick or something, but it's pretty cool.
Well, I'm glad you clarified that, Tim, because I was confused for a second. I'm a mere chemist that I am.
Anyway, should we get Dora on?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's our great pleasure to welcome Dora Biro, who's based over on the east coast of the US. So, good morning to you, Dora. Thanks very much for joining us. Perhaps you just say a few words to introduce yourself and
Yeah,
what you
thanks,
do.
Tim. Thanks very much for having me. My name's Dora Biro. I'm currently a professor of brain and cognitive sciences at the University of Rochester, which is in upstate New York, technically Western New York, but yeah, upstate is more more attractive sounding. And I work on animal cognition in a number of different species, primarily primates and birds, but recently also kind of getting into fish cognition, fish behavior as well.
Cool. No, that's really exciting. And how did you get into animal behavior? I have to say, it's probably the same at Rochester, and you spent some time at Oxford, obviously. It's like what most of our biology students want to do, isn't it? They come in and they want to understand why the animals are doing like kind of the behaviors they're doing. So,
Right.
so how did you get into it? I mean, is it because you'd always enjoyed watching sort of chickens walk around going step, step, peck, or
I think you put your finger on it. It's just something that I think most people will find fascinating. I mean, anyone who's got pets or happen to watch animals, wherever, whether in cities or out in the countryside, they do amazing things. They do puzzling things. They clearly have their own minds that sort of drive how they interact with the world and with each other. And those minds are going to be somewhat different from ours, in some cases fairly similar, in some cases pretty significantly different. And so to me, that was just a fascinating question always is, evolution has produced a bunch of different brains, right? And those brains each process information, they each sort of guide how the animal interacts with the world. And so those kinds of similarities and differences between how different species, different individual creatures engage with the world was always very, very interesting to me. And I think a really another sort of driving force for me, and I grew up in a city, my family was never very outdoorsy. So,
okay.
I didn't really engage with nature in my youth. But what I did do was watch a lot of David Attenborough documentaries. And in particular, I think in the very first one, I think it's, is it Life on Earth?
Yeah,
Was
that would be about right. I think that was out in probably the early 80s, maybe, or
Yeah,
yeah.
this is my sort of memory from the 80s is my whole family sort of gathering around the TV and watching Life on Earth week after week. And that particular series, I think, was really great because it was really focused on evolution and on sort of showing you these very kind of curious things that animals do. that these curious things are things that natural selection has produced. And so that really fascinated me, is to sort of understand how this completely random process was able to produce just the most fascinating, the kind of cleverest solutions to some of the problems that animals encounter in the environment. So I think that, that was a
That's what
really
drew
fun.
you in.
Yeah. So just sort of wanting to understand how we've ended up in a world where, animals do these amazing things.
And I guess it's amazing since those days, which actually wasn't that long ago, with that very first series you talk about, David Attenborough, how far we've come in our understanding.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, animal cognition has been around for a good number of decades, but I think we've really, we're really beginning to understand a lot more about, how and why animals do the kinds of things that they do. So, yeah, I think it's endlessly fascinating.
And as you said, you've kind of worked on all sorts of organisms, and you mentioned fish. So just for our listeners, I remember, a few years ago hearing that goldfish have a memory of like 3 seconds, and they just swim around the bowl going, "Oh, oh, a bowl." Oh. But I think we've kind of moved on a little bit from there, haven't we? So,
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a regular joke in our lab, actually, that goldfish 3 second memory rule. Whenever the fish fail to complete some task or something like that, we'll sort of jest about that. But I mean, yes, of course. I mean, we've seen that fish can learn, they can solve problems, they can work together to solve problems even. And so I think that's one of the things that the field of animal cognition has done, is kind of debunk a lot of these sort of myths about the limitations that animals have, although it's also taught us about some of the limitations that they have, which are equally important. But yeah, I think sort of I think that's one of the things that also drives me, is sort of understanding how, or exploring the extent to which our sort of understanding of what's going on in the animals' minds can be explored experimentally, rather than just sort of looking at them and then anthropomorphizing about what might be going on in their brains. We can actually study this systematically through the scientific method to get a much better understanding of what their sort of constraints, limitations, capacities really are.
So, Dora, what's been the most sort of, I guess, the most surprising thing that you found in terms of animal culture? Something you weren't, is there something that, sort of just came completely unexpected, for example?
Um, uh, Animal culture specifically?
or animal
Or any
cognition.
aspect of sort of animal learning, for example,
um,
that you've encountered?
ooh, oh gosh, that's a good question.
Sorry.
I mean, there's lots of surprising things. I think that's, yeah, sorry, I need to think about this a little bit, but along these lines of sort of surprising findings, I think that's actually one of the ways in which I've kind of been quite fortunate in my work, that I sort of have had several experiences of this kind, where you sort of watch an animal and you sort of kind of think you understand what's happening, and then they do something completely unexpected that it's either through some mistake you made in setting up the experiment, or something went wrong, and then you observe something that is it's a kind of fortuitous occasion where you see something that you really weren't expecting to see, and it's a moment of realization where you suddenly think, actually, this is really important. And, I can actually now take this and run with it and do something interesting with it. So, so I have, a couple of examples of this, of where, something unexpected happened in an experiment. And it just, it was really a kind of aha moment that gives you an idea for sort of, further work to really dissect what you've just observed. And actually, one of the examples of that comes from the paper that I think Tim is hoping to discuss, where we'd been studying tool use in wild chimpanzees for a number of years, and there actually happened to be a sort of gap in my fieldwork schedule. So I had been going to this field site for many years, and then had a break of I think about 5 years or something like that. Went back, and then saw an individual do something that we had never seen her do before, and we felt that this was potentially due to this individual having aged into a kind of reaching towards the kind of extreme old age which these animals reach in the wild. And so so her behavior was just so very different from what we had been used to seeing from her for the past 10-15 years. She seemed to be kind of really heavily affected by aging. And so that then sort of opened up a whole new research line for us in looking at kind of how, we'd been interested in how young animals learn certain complex behaviors in the wild. So kind of at the beginning of the lifetime of an individual, how are complex skills acquired? And then suddenly this whole new question of, okay, now what happens at the end of life opened up to us, and that's a really, really understudied area. And suddenly we had this opportunity to look into that in more detail in the wild, which was amazing.
So we'll come on to onto that paper on chimps in the second half of the podcast. Right. Before we get there, the whole kind of animal cognition and why they're behaving like they are has really advanced a lot in recent years, partly because there's been kind of advances in tech. We can scan animal brains sometimes when they're doing behaviors, some very clever experiments that people have come up. But can we ever know what it's like to be a bat or a cat or my dog Woofler? Is that ever going to be possible? It strikes me that, my dog has very different senses. Obviously, the same senses, but he smells appalling, but he's very good at smelling. And, he's got pretty good vision. So how far, how much can we really learn about what it's like to be a different species?
Yeah, you're right. It's not just about the cognition of the animal and how it processes information, but it's also about the sensory experience of that animal. So what are the senses that it's actually using to sort of map and interpret the world. So I think, already at that stage, the differences can be so huge that, to imagine what it's like, for instance, for a bird to perceive magnetic fields or something like that. There was a paper a while ago that showed that these magnetoreceptors might be located in the eye. So the suggestion was that maybe they're actually seeing these magnetic fields. But for us to imagine something like that is, I think that's a very difficult task. But just sort of anecdotally, also, I recently got kittens for the first time. I've never had mammalian pets before. And that's actually been really interesting to me to watch their behavior, because I realized that, as predators, they actually engage with the world in a very different way from what we're used to as primates. In that, for instance, they don't seem to be motivated to change the environment in any way, to sort of engage with it actively, right? They sort of move through the environment, they'll weave through obstacles and things like that, but they don't tend to, open boxes or sort of try and change the environment in significant ways.
Like monkeys and chimps would, right?
Like primates would. Right. And so, if something moves, they'll chase it because that's what predators do. But, to them, it made me think that perhaps, they perceive the world differently, in the sense that they don't perceive it as something they can change, right? It's
that's interesting.
there, and you move through it as best you can. But, when you're a primate, you'll manipulate everything and, turn things over and open and, bang and, and so on. So, that sort of fundamental.
Huh.
I guess you have sort of habitat building though in non-primates, like sort of dam building and
Oh, yeah, 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 right.
so I guess there's a sort of a manipulation of the environment, perhaps.
Yeah.
There's a half
Yeah.
house.
I mean, it very much depends on the animal's lifestyle,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's, I think, one of the lessons we learn from animal cognition, especially when, there's a sort of bridge between behavioral ecology and animal cognition, that we sort of try to understand why the cognition of that animal is the way it is, given the kind of lifestyle that it has. So,
Yeah.
dam building makes sense for an animal that, lives in an environment where something like that can happen and can be beneficial. Um,
And
yeah.
Dora, so I'm not a biologist, as Tim will point out many times, by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm actually a chemist and a biochemist. So it's interesting for me to sort of many of these behaviors and things. I'm guessing, and I don't know the answer to this, and you'll know this more than I. Can it be directly linked to intelligence? Are there or is it more more nuanced than that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think actually tool use in animals is a good example of this, because it's it's there's a whole line of research on tool use in animals, right? And so to study tool use in animals, you have to first define what tool use is. And that's already kind of hurdle number one that I don't think we've kind of really fully cleared, because there's multiple different definitions of tool use. They agree on some aspects, but they also differ in some aspects. So, what you class as tool use in the first place might differ depending on what definition you use. There's always going to be edge cases where, we're not quite sure, is this tool use or not? Um, and But I think one of the really important aspects of this in relation to your question is that we tend to think of tool use as kind of clever, right? So, this is the animal being creative, using objects creatively to solve problems in the environment. But if you actually look at which species use tools and how, what you find is, well, first of all, it's a very rare behavior, very rare trait in the wild. So I think we worked out once that something like less than 0.1% of all known animal genera, so not species, but genera, use tools. So it is very rare. And at the same time, the distribution of tool use is very sort of eclectic around the animal kingdom. So it's not the case that you get one lineage where most of the tool users occur, but it's distributed very, very widely, phylogenetically, very kind of, it pops up in, I think 4 out of the 5 animal phyla. So you get a bunch of different tool using species, but it's actually very difficult to work out what they have in common, because and actually you can sort of if you look at how an individual animal actually comes to use tools, you find that in some cases it's very much genetic, or at least to some extent under genetic control. And so, this argument that it's a form of creative problem solving kind of falls apart. Whereas in other species, it does seem to be a case of creative problem solving. So I think it kind of shows that we tend to think of tool use as this kind of unified phenomenon, right? It's an animal using an object in the environment to achieve a certain goal. But actually, in terms of what it says about their cognition, we then need to think about, whether it's a learned behavior, whether the animal actually kind of innovated and was creative about solving some problem in the environment, or simply that it was, it's essentially genetically pre-programmed to do this. So, yeah.
So I think this is a really good point, because we're going to come back and talk about your recent paper, but we'll just take a brief break.
Hi, Tim. You're looking particularly snazzy today. What are you wearing?
I'm wearing a piece from a company called Grace and Garbo. And actually, you know a little bit more about them than I do, to be honest.
Yeah, you're right, I do. And
You're
as
the
you can
fashion
see,
queen. Yeah.
I'm also wearing a piece from Grace and Garbo. So this is a delightful knitwear outfit set up in Birmingham. What they do is they source knitwear, quality knitwear from all around the world. So it's vintage, one-off pieces, many of which they then hand embellish, like the one you're wearing today with its beautiful purple flowers. And so they're big on sustainability. Nothing goes to waste. Everything is sort of recycled and reused. And if you want to know more about them, then have a look at the link beneath this episode.
And thank you very much to them for supporting our podcast. Hope their sales soar.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Grace and Garbo.
Well, welcome back, everyone. And we're chatting to Dora Biro, who's a behavioural ecologist, or animal behaviour specialist, works on animal cognition as well. And you've recently published a very nice paper, Dora, in a journal called Eli, so it's a very good journal. It's called Old Age Variability Impacts Chimpanzee Engagement and Efficiency in Stone Tool Use. And we'll put a link to your paper below for our listeners, and it's free to anyone to download. It's not behind a paywall or anything. So congratulations on that. So chimps use tools in all sorts of ways, don't they? Perhaps you can kind of explain what they use tools for. I know it differs between populations and individuals as well.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, chimpanzees. So chimpanzees are alongside bonobos are humans' closest evolutionary relatives. And they also happen to be the most prolific tool users in the wild out of any non-human animal. So they have a variety of different tools that they use in the wild, ranging from tools that aid them in foraging to tools that they use in sort of self-maintenance or even in social situations. So they have tools that they use in order to interact with another individual in certain ways. But primarily though, the tools are really used in foraging, and that can take many different forms. I think maybe the most famous example of chimpanzee tool use is termite fishing, which is actually where the field of animal tool use really begins. So that was a discovery by Jane Goodall in the 70s that chimpanzees basically will break off a little branch, they'll strip it of leaves, and then they'll take the kind of remaining stem and they'll insert it into holes in termite mounds. The termites climb up on the stick, the chimpanzee then withdraws the stick, and they can eat the insects off the end. So that's one form of tool use. Yeah, there's many others. So the one that we have been studying in Guinea and West Africa is called nutcracking. And that's where chimpanzees use stone tools. So hammer stone, and in our case, a separate anvil stone, where they will place a nut on top of the anvil, and then they'll use the other stone to kind of pound that nut until it breaks open, and then they get access to the nutritious kernel. So the nut is basically too strong to be opened with teeth alone. So you need these stone tools to actually process the item. And so that's the behavior that we've been studying in this one particular community of chimpanzees in Guinea. The field site's called Bosu. It's one of the longest running wild chimpanzee field sites in Africa. It was launched in the 70s by Kyoto University. Yukimaru Sugiyama was the individual who first established Bosu as a long-term field site, and it's been running ever since. And over those decades, we've discovered a number of other tool use behaviors that this particular community performs. Interestingly, they don't do termite fishing. But they do a sort of related variant called ant dipping, where instead of going to a termite mound, they'll find a marching line of army ants and they'll sort of perch safely above very aggressive ants. So you don't want to be in their path. But then they'll take a stick and they'll dip that into the line of marching army ants. And then again, the army ants climb up the stick, and then you can sort of pull the stick through your teeth and just very quickly before they sting you. So that's another behavior that they perform. Algae scooping is another one where they'll take a stick and they use that to kind of scrape algae off the surface of a pond.
Wow.
So it's a way of avoiding getting wet.
It's amazing, actually. It's a real broad range. So, Simon, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I was just sort of curious. You said that, so you've got this site where you've got this community of chimpanzees, and there's this, that they're using these tools. So when you sort of start the study, do is it hypothesis driven? Do you know what you're looking for? Or is the idea observation and then you find traits and then these are the ones we're going to follow? Because it's a very different way of doing science than the one I'm used
Right.
to. It's fascinating
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah, I think this is where natural history, I think, is something that um, has become somewhat sidelined in recent decades, right? Like that's sort of the beginnings of our sort of interest in animals is a natural history driven interest, right? We watch the animals and we see what interesting things they do, and then on the basis of that, we can then think of how to now dig into these things more carefully through experimentation. But I think essentially, I think you're right, Simon, that there is no hypothesis at the very beginning of this, right? You sort of have to go and watch these animals in their natural habitat during their sort of natural everyday behaviors to basically see what it is that they do that you can then kind of try and probe.
I think it's wonderful because it's sort of, in a way, perhaps many of us are here as scientists because of observation, right?
Mhm.
It's the
In
first
a
point,
way.
isn't it? Yeah, first point on the scientific journey. You
Yeah.
see
That's
something.
right. I think I think you can't do science with that you can't sort of come in with a hypothesis not having seen what the animals actually do. And yeah, like I was sort of referencing at the beginning, I think that's where some of the best ideas come from, is just sort of sitting back and watching and letting your kind of mind take in what's happening and then noticing something,
Yeah.
that's
But I think
fascinating.
what's really impressive, actually, and it kind of relates to this, is this study that you're talking about and you've been working on has been running for so long, and you were able to observe the same animals
Yeah,
doing the same type of behavior over
right.
decades, right? And
Yes.
and you discovered that, a bit like as I'm getting worse and worse as I get older at doing various tasks, chimps do the same, right? So they senesce almost as quickly as I'm senescing, I think.
Yes, I can relate to this too, for sure. Um,
Before we, just for our readers' sakes, what is the lifespan of one of these chimpanzees? So
it's a,
just to get an idea of what younger.
yeah, it's a great question. So it's going to differ in the wild from what it is in captivity. So in captivity, there have been chimps that have really lived to some extraordinary ages. Um, 60s, 70s, potentially even 80s. I'm not sure if those reports are legit, but in the wild, animals don't tend to live as long as they do in captivity. In fact, this was one of the kind of hypotheses for why we might not observe senescence in animals, because outside of a kind of domesticated setting or in zoo settings or something like that, animals are going to die of starvation or disease or predation or, whatever, well before they get to the age at which they might exhibit senescence. But that hypothesis has been challenged since, and there is now data out there from a good number of species showing that, yes, indeed, animals do reach ages at which they senesce, even in the wild.
So the
Um,
ones you're studying are about 70, you said? They can live to about 70 years?
Um, It's very, very, very rare. I think in captivity, I would say probably around 50s might be the typical kind of
So
very old age.
that's what you have to work with, right? A lifespan
Yes.
of about 50 years.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, yeah, so in the wild, like I said, it's going to be less, but we're kind of fortunate to work with a group of chimpanzees that I think are possibly kind of best placed to allow individuals to reach these very old ages because they so the community, the group that we study is a relatively small one, and it happens to live on this kind of basically island of forest that is surrounded by savanna and agricultural land. I mean, all apes pretty much in Africa are affected in some way by anthropogenic change. And so these guys live on this island of forest where, as it also happens, the local human population, the ethnic group who live there, consider chimpanzees to be their ancestors. So they're essentially totem animals for this particular group of people, which means they don't hunt them. They, in fact, the forest itself is a sacred forest, so they don't, there's really very little, relatively very little encroachment on the chimpanzee space, but they are stuck on this island and they don't really have any neighbors that they interact with, neighboring chimpanzee groups, which also means, they're not
fighting all the time, are they?
fighting or, patrolling their territory, getting into fights with neighboring groups. They also don't have any natural predators around. So basically, the scene is set for them to live as long as, they can possibly make it. And so
tell us what you found. Tell us what you found in the study, because we're kind of running out of time a little bit.
Yes, sorry. Okay, so what we found, so we had been studying nut cracking in these chimpanzees for many, many years. My particular interest was in the development of this skill. So we were looking at how young chimpanzees sort of learn this relatively very complex skill. And it is a very long learning process. It takes them years to actually get to the point where they're able to open a nut with stones. And yeah, so we've been studying how this skill sort of comes to be part of the chimpanzee's repertoire in the early stages of life. And then one year we had this. We made this fortuitous observation where one of the adult females in the group, who had been one of the most prolific, most sort of proficient, skilled, very streamlined nutcracker. We hadn't seen her in a few years because we hadn't been to the field site in a few years. And so when we went back a number of years later, there had been this really profound change in her behavior that really struck us. Whereas before she was kind of very, her actions, very proficient. Her actions were, very clean, very streamlined. Now she seemed, and I'm going to sound like I'm anthropomorphizing now, but she just looked very confused all of a sudden about what she was doing. So she would be sort of halfway through cracking a nut and then sort of stop and look at the stone and put it down and pick up another one. And so she almost seemed to kind of forget halfway through what it was that she was doing. Before she would just, pick up two stones and then use those same two stones repeatedly until she was done. Now she was kind of picking up, 7 different stones, like dropping them, picking up, swapping her tools out halfway through having attempted to crack a nut. And,
so she was a bit confused, do you think?
She seemed confused. She seemed like she had kind of forgotten how to do the whole process. Because nut cracking itself is it's really one of the most complex forms of tool use in the wild, because, and there's different ways you can define complexity, but if you think about it in terms of the number of different objects you have to combine in a specific spatiotemporal order, right? So you have to, first place an anvil down, and it has to be placed such that it has a level enough surface that you can put a nut on top. So then you put the nut, and then you have to bring in this third object, right? That you then use to pound the object with. So the nut with. So it's complex in the sense that, yeah, you have to get all these objects into the right place at the right time with the right kinds of actions. And so, yeah, our feeling was that, if you're going to see cognitive decline in old age in any behavior in the wild, it's probably going to, be evident in these kind of more complex behaviors that really require, things like, memory, spatiotemporal organization, planning, all kinds of things. And these are
was this only seen in one out of the 5 elderly chimps?
So then it was very obvious in this one chimpanzee, but we did have a number of other individuals who were kind of reaching similarly old ages. And so that then gave us the idea to look in more detail at those individuals as well, and to really sort of try and look at multiple different aspects of the tool using behavior. So, how streamlined the actions are, how quickly they're able to do it, how many hits of the hammerstone they need to actually open a single nut, various sort of metrics that give us a sense of the efficiency with which these animals were able to crack nuts. And so what we then saw was that, across these 5 different individuals that we ended up sampling, there was, most of them showed some signs of deterioration in terms of the efficiency of the behavior. And different individuals showed stronger or weaker effects in the different metrics. So it sort of showed us really that there is an effect of old age on the efficiency with which these animals are able to perform this particular tool use behavior, but that there's also variation in how.
So it's very like humans. I mean, I know that this is anthropomorphizing and speculative, but do you think she was this highly proficient chimp that then lost the ability to do this, had something like Alzheimer's or dementia?
So that was my immediate thought.
Yeah.
And I'll sort of roll back on that a little bit, because that's a fairly strong claim that I think we would need to support with neuropathological data and things like that, which unfortunately we weren't able to do. There are captive studies though that have shown that so if you do look at the brain of a deceased old-aged individual, chimpanzee, you do find the kind of neuropathological signatures of Alzheimer's, which it's a relatively recent discovery, but that I think that would support that hypothesis that this could have been a case of that. But the trouble is it's also tied in with physical deterioration in old age. So, the loss of strength, the loss of muscle, loss of maybe, coordination of some kind. I don't want to make that claim that this is a case of dementia. It looked like it, but I think it's hard to separate from sort of other ways in which the animals
physical decline.
Physical decline. Yeah.
So I think we better wrap this up soon. One last question, Syma.
Yeah, I guess so. This sounds sort of almost counter to everything you've said, because we're saying that they're getting confused in perhaps this particular one with. But I was thinking that was there any evidence that they are then sort of compensating by choosing other tasks that are easier to do?
Oh, great question. So the nutrition that these chimpanzees get from nut cracking it's not absolutely essential to them. So not all chimpanzees crack nuts. And even within our community, we have a couple of adults that just never learned the skill. We're not entirely sure why. But, it's not like they're the ones who end up starving within the group. So there's plenty of other food around. It's more of it's very nutritious. The nuts are very nutritious, so the chimps do like them. But there is plentiful food available in the forest for them to fall back on. It's hard to say how they're compensating, or even if they need to really compensate for any loss of nutrition through this. We did also notice that they All the studies take place in this location called the Outdoor Laboratory at our field site, which is basically a clearing in the forest where we can provide objects. So we basically put out a bunch of stones of different sizes, shapes, materials to kind of see how chimps select appropriate objects from the environment to use as tools. And we basically rely on these chimpanzees to just pass through the outdoor lab during their daily travels, and then they usually stop and will start to nut crack and engage with the objects there. But one thing we also noticed was that these older females in particular, they stopped coming less into the outdoor lab. And we weren't entirely sure why that was. It could be that they're not really interested in nut cracking so much anymore because they're finding it more difficult. It could have been that, so this outdoor lab is at the top of one of the rather steep hills within the forest, so maybe they just don't have the strength to climb there anymore. So they're certainly, spending their time in other ways. But yeah, it's unclear if they really kind of need to compensate specifically for loss of nutrition in this case. So I mean, lots of things change in the at this kind of very advanced age in chimpanzees. So, for example, we also found we look at kind of social network analysis that they sort of withdraw from the group. So they kind of become peripheral, much more peripheral within the group's social network. So again, very similar to,
to humans, yeah.
Similar changes in humans, right? Where it's also shown that your sort of social circle shrinks as you become older. So that's exactly what's happening in these chimps too. So they're spending their days differently in old age than they did when they were younger.
No, it's fascinating stuff, Dora, and we better wrap it up actually, because I said we'd try and keep it. As always, we end up, getting so into hearing about all the research that people do. But really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and we'll put a link to the paper below. But it really has been fascinating.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you both for having me.
Not at all. Our pleasure.
Well, Tim, so that was fascinating.
It really was. And I mean, I think learning, I think everyone loves animals. It's, she's right. So many of us got into biology, or even if we didn't, so many people were impressed by those David Attenborough shows that he's still making at over 90, right? I mean, it's just incredible. And it's great that it's actually driving science by bringing people like Dora in.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways in which they're important. I guess they're visual. I mean, interestingly, my grandmother, paternal grandmother, was completely illiterate. And when she came to England, the thing that, kept her watching television was David Attenborough.
Oh, wow.
Because it was visual, and she couldn't understand what he was saying, but she'd get the gist and maybe not the nuances, but work it out. And I think there's this. For all of us, there's these connections and this, you try not to anthropomorphize, I can't say that word, things, but we do, right?
No, we do. But I mean, some animals behave very differently. I mean, my dog Woofer isn't behind me at the moment, but, if he was, I'd be able to sort of say, here I am with Woofer. But anyway, So, and I think it's fascinating. I think one of the really interesting things is it's so difficult to keep a study going on a population of animals for as long as this chimp study has been going on, because you've got to get grant funding to go over there. You've got to find students who are interested in working on it. Although I suspect there's quite a lot of students who say, "Yeah, I'll go and look at some chimps in the forest."
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the very first episodes we did with Nilo and Ben, when they talked about the Great Tit study at Whiteham, and that is a very long study, very long running study, but it was sort of in a way more straightforward for them to do because it's in Oxford and it was easier
just
to
down the road, yeah.
And you can do it in a way without, of course you need grant funding, but you can do it with undergraduate project students, and it's some aspects of it anyway. But this is another level, and in terms of difficulty, and it's and even then, even though they've kept it going for such a long time, it is 5 chimpanzees that they're looking at.
Yeah, well, data from those 5. I think there's more in the group, but it is interesting, isn't it, that they're living long enough, because for many animals, as soon as you start to have those declines, something's going to kill you, right? I work on in Yellowstone, and wolves will tend to take the older elk, right? As they start to slow down, they can't run as fast, they get eaten. I mean, they take the babies as well, but so it's really interesting, I think, that they can detect these in wild living animals, in these chimpanzees, that they can start to see these behavioral declines. And I mean, I know that she's very cautious to sort of say it looks like some sort of brain degenerative disease, but it is similar, isn't it, to what we see in people?
Yeah, what she described as this sort of confusion and sort of, forgetting halfway through, or, what she was doing with trying to, trying to break open these nuts is, as you said, is something we see. I mean, it happens to all of us as we get older, right?
Speak for yourself.
You mean you've always been like this?
I don't think I've ever tried to actually crack a walnut on an anvil with a rock, but I might start monitoring myself from now on.
So yeah, I think yeah, I mean, I learned a lot. I think it was interesting to me about these. Well, I think we didn't quite get into it, but would be good to follow up with her at some point. Is sort of the sort of full spectrum of characteristics and traits we see in humans.
Yeah,
How
exactly.
big is that spectrum in chimpanzees, for example? How wide is that spectrum?
Yeah, no, no, exactly. Anyway, that was great fun. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. Details below. And we'll be back next week with another episode. So thank you for listening.